When Rachel returned to the table, Jake's attention immediately shifted back to her, but not in a way that excluded me from the conversation. Instead, he seemed to understand that accepting Rachel meant accepting me as an important part of her life. Over the following months, Jake became a regular presence in our circle. He joined us for some of our Sunday farmers market walks, though he was careful not to intrude on our tradition every week. He brought thoughtful gifts to dinner parties, remembered my birthday without prompting from Rachel, and even offered to help with a particularly challenging website design project I was struggling with, connecting me with a developer friend who saved me hours of frustration. Rachel was happier than I'd seen her in years. She smiled more, laughed more easily, and had a new confidence that seemed to radiate from her increased sense of being truly appreciated by someone who understood her value. Jake encouraged her ambitions at Morrison Associates, celebrated her successes, and provided a sympathetic ear when workplace politics became particularly frustrating. Their relationship progressed at a pace that felt natural and healthy. They took weekend trips to the coast, explored Portland's restaurant scene together, and slowly began building the kind of shared experiences that form the foundation of lasting partnerships. Jake was patient with Rachel's initial guardedness, understanding that her caution came from past hurt rather than lack of interest in him. About 8 months into their relationship, Jake surprised Rachel with a weekend getaway to a bed and breakfast in Cannon Beach. I helped him plan some of the details, suggesting restaurants Rachel would love and activities that would appeal to her. When they returned, Rachel was practically floating with happiness. She showed me dozens of photos from their trip, her face glowing as she described long walks on the beach, intimate dinners, and meaningful conversations about their future together. That future became more concrete when Jake asked Rachel to move in with him after they'd been dating for a year. He'd found a larger apartment in the Hawthorne neighborhood, close to Rachel's favorite coffee shops and within walking distance of several galleries I enjoyed visiting. The space had a dedicated office area where Rachel could work from home when needed and enough room for both of their belongings without feeling cramped. I helped Rachel pack her old apartment and settle into the new space with Jake. The move went smoothly, and their home quickly became a warm, welcoming place where Jake and Rachel's individual styles blended seamlessly. Jake's modern furniture complemented Rachel's collection of vintage finds and travel mementos, creating an environment that felt both sophisticated and comfortable. During this period, our friendship continued much as it always had, though with natural adjustments to accommodate Rachel's new relationship. Our Sunday farmers market walks became slightly less frequent, but Jake often encouraged Rachel to maintain our tradition, sometimes suggesting she invite me over for dinner afterward so they could both hear about my latest dating adventures or work projects. Jake seemed to understand that healthy relationships require maintaining individual friendships and interests. He had his own friend group from his consulting work and his recreational soccer league, giving Rachel space to nurture our friendship without feeling like she was neglecting him. When I went through a particularly difficult breakup with a man I'd been seeing for several months, Jake was genuinely supportive, offering both practical advice and emotional support that felt authentic rather than obligatory. Everything changed, however, after Jake proposed. The engagement happened on a crisp December evening, exactly 2 years after they'd first met. Jake had planned an elaborate proposal at Powell's City of Books, the iconic Portland bookstore where Rachel and I had spent countless hours browsing and where she'd often said she'd love to get engaged someday if she ever found the right person. He'd arranged with the staff to create a special display featuring books about love and adventure, with the engagement ring hidden inside a first edition of Rachel's favorite novel. Rachel called me immediately afterward, sobbing with joy and disbelief. "Emma," she said through tears, "he proposed. He actually proposed, and it was perfect, and I said yes, and I can't believe this is real." I was genuinely thrilled for her. Rachel deserved this kind of happiness, and Jake had proven over 2 years that he was capable of loving her the way she deserved to be loved. We spent hours that night talking about wedding plans, discussing venues and color schemes and all the details that seemed simultaneously overwhelming and exciting. The engagement party Jake threw a month later was beautiful and tasteful, held at a small event space in Southeast Portland with carefully curated food and drinks that reflected both Rachel's and Jake's preferences. All of Rachel's friends and family attended, along with Jake's growing network of Portland connections. I gave a maid of honor speech that made Rachel cry happy tears, and Jake's best man from college flew in from San Diego to celebrate with them. But something began shifting after the engagement, so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. The changes started small. Rachel began canceling our Sunday farmers market walks more frequently, usually with apologetic texts explaining that Jake had planned surprise activities or that they needed to handle wedding planning tasks. When we did meet for our regular coffee dates, Rachel seemed distracted, often checking her phone or cutting our conversations short because Jake needed her input on something important. I initially attributed these changes to normal engagement excitement and the demands of wedding planning. Rachel had always been detail-oriented, and organizing a wedding while maintaining her demanding career at Morrison Associates would naturally require adjustments to her social calendar. I tried to be understanding and supportive, offering to help with wedding tasks and being flexible about our plans. However, as weeks turned into months, I began noticing more concerning patterns. Rachel stopped initiating contact as frequently as she once had. Our traditional wine and movie nights became sporadic, often rescheduled at the last minute because of wedding-related obligations or Jake's needs. When we did spend time together, Rachel seemed anxious, frequently checking her phone and sometimes leaving abruptly if Jake called or texted. More troubling was the gradual change in Rachel's personality during our interactions. She'd always been confident and decisive, someone who knew her own mind and wasn't afraid to express her opinions. But increasingly, she seemed uncertain about things that had never bothered her before. She'd ask my opinion on restaurant choices, clothing decisions, or weekend activities with an anxiety that felt completely unlike the self-assured woman I'd known for 15 years. When I gently asked if everything was okay, Rachel would insist that she was just stressed about wedding planning and adjusting to engaged life. She'd smile and change the subject, but the smile never quite reached her eyes the way it used to. I began to worry that the pressure of planning a wedding while maintaining her career was taking a toll on her mental health. But whenever I suggested she might benefit from taking a break or asking for help, she'd become defensive and insist that she could handle everything. Jake's behavior during this period seemed supportive on the surface, but I started noticing subtle things that made me uncomfortable. I never imagined that standing alone in a cemetery parking lot, watching my best friend's fiancé drive away without me, would be the moment I discovered the most devastating betrayal of my life. What I thought was cruel abandonment turned out to be the key that unlocked a web of manipulation so twisted, it had been slowly destroying Rachel for months before that rainy November day when her car skidded off Highway 26. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Collins, and until 6 months ago, I thought I understood friendship, loyalty, and love. I was 32, living in a cozy one-bedroom apartment in Portland's Pearl District, making a decent living as a freelance graphic designer. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I had my morning coffee ritual at the corner bakery, weekend hiking trips to Mount Hood, and most importantly, I had Rachel Thompson, the sister I never had by blood but chose through 15 years of unshakable friendship. Rachel and I met during our sophomore year at Portland State University in a cramped computer lab at 2 in the morning, both of us frantically trying to finish projects that were due the next day. She was majoring in marketing while I struggled through my graphic design coursework, and somehow between sharing stale vending machine cookies and complaining about our professors, we discovered we were both from small Oregon towns, both the first in our families to attend college, and both absolutely terrible at time management. From that night forward, we were inseparable. We studied together, traveled together, celebrated each other's successes, and held each other through heartbreaks. When Rachel landed her dream job at Morrison Associates, a prestigious marketing firm downtown, I was the first person she called. When I finally built up enough clients to quit my soul-crushing corporate design job and go freelance, Rachel helped me move into my Pearl District apartment and brought champagne to Kristen, my new home office. We had traditions that felt sacred to us. Sunday morning farmers market walks followed by brunch at whichever new restaurant Rachel had discovered that week. Monthly wine and movie nights where we'd alternate between romantic comedies that made us cry and horror films that made us hide behind throw pillows. Annual camping trips to Crater Lake where we'd spend hours talking about our dreams, our fears, and everything in between under star-filled skies. Rachel was the kind of friend who remembered that I hated cilantro and always ordered accordingly. When we shared meals, she knew I got anxious before big client presentations and would text me encouragement at exactly the right moments. When my father had his heart attack 2 years ago, Rachel drove with me to Bend without hesitation, sat in hospital waiting rooms for hours, and somehow made terrible cafeteria coffee taste bearable just by being there. In return, I like to think I was the friend Rachel deserved. I listened when she vented about difficult clients at Morrison Associates. I celebrated her promotions with the same enthusiasm I'd show for my own achievements. I helped her paint her Hawthorne neighborhood house the cheerful yellow she dreamed about for months, and I was genuinely thrilled when she finally felt financially stable enough to buy a place of her own. Rachel had always been cautious about relationships. She'd been hurt before by men who didn't appreciate her kindness, her intelligence, or her unwavering loyalty to the people she cared about. She dated occasionally, but nothing serious ever developed. She used to joke that she was married to her career and I was her work wife, and honestly, we were both content with that arrangement. Then Jake Martinez entered our lives. I first met Jake on a drizzly Thursday evening in March, about 2.5 years ago. Rachel had texted me that afternoon asking if I wanted to join her for happy hour at Brew and Bean Cafe, our usual spot for catching up during the week. When I arrived, she was sitting at our favorite corner table, but she wasn't alone. A tall, dark-haired man in an expensive-looking navy blazer sat across from her, leaning forward with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was completely captivated by whatever Rachel was saying. Rachel's face lit up when she saw me approaching, and she gestured enthusiastically for me to join them. "Emma," she said, practically glowing with excitement, "I want you to meet Jake Martinez." "Jake, this is Emma, my best friend I've told you so much about." Jake stood to shake my hand, his grip firm and confident. His smile was warm and genuine, the kind that reached his eyes and made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Emma," he said. "Rachel talks about you constantly. I was starting to think you might be imaginary." I liked him immediately, which surprised me. Rachel's previous boyfriends had often felt like they were competing with our friendship rather than embracing it. They'd make subtle comments about girls' nights or roll their eyes when Rachel would text me during dates. But Jake seemed different. He asked about my design work with genuine curiosity, laughed at my stories about difficult clients, and even suggested that I might be able to help with some marketing materials for his consulting business. Jake owned a small business consulting firm that helped struggling restaurants and retail shops improve their operations and marketing strategies. It was exactly the kind of work that would appeal to Rachel's problem-solving nature and her desire to help others succeed. He was 34, had moved to Portland from San Diego about a year earlier for a fresh start after his previous business partnership had ended badly, and he was clearly smitten with my best friend. As the evening progressed, I watched Jake's interactions with Rachel carefully. He remembered details from conversations they'd apparently had, asked follow-up questions about her work projects, and seemed genuinely interested in her opinions on everything from Portland's food scene to local politics. When Rachel excused herself to use the restroom, Jake turned to me with an earnest expression. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," he said, "but Rachel is incredible. I've never met anyone quite like her. She's brilliant and kind and funny, and she clearly thinks the world of you. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person she is." I found myself warming to him even more. Anyone who recognized Rachel's extraordinary qualities and valued our friendship was someone I could support.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He'd call Rachel during our coffee dates with questions that seemed to require immediate attention, interrupting our conversations and leaving Rachel apologetic and flustered. He'd make comments about how much time Rachel spent on work or with friends, framing them as jokes but with an underlying tone that suggested disapproval. When I mentioned these observations to Lisa Park, another close friend from our college days who remained part of our circle, she admitted she'd noticed similar changes. Lisa worked as a nurse at Portland General Hospital and had always been particularly attuned to signs of stress or emotional distress in the people she cared about. "I thought it was just wedding stress at first," Lisa told me during a conversation at her apartment one evening in early fall. "But Emma, have you noticed how Rachel apologizes for everything now? She used to be so confident, so sure of herself. Now she seems like she's constantly worried about disappointing someone." I had noticed, though I'd been trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Rachel had indeed begun apologizing for things that didn't warrant apologies, being a few minutes late to meet me, ordering a different drink than usual, expressing opinions about movies or restaurants. It was as if she'd become afraid of making wrong choices or inconveniencing anyone, even in the smallest ways. The most concerning incident occurred about 3 weeks before Rachel's death, though I didn't understand its significance until much later. Rachel and I had planned to attend an art gallery opening in the Pearl District, something we'd both been looking forward to for weeks. The artist was someone whose work I particularly admired, and Rachel had been excited to surprise me with tickets she'd purchased in advance. On the day of the event, Rachel texted me an hour before we were supposed to meet, saying she couldn't make it because Jake needed her help with something urgent related to his business. She seemed genuinely upset about canceling and insisted I go without her, even offering to pay for an Uber so I wouldn't have to worry about parking downtown. I went to the gallery opening alone, feeling disappointed but trying to understand that emergencies happen and relationships require compromise. However, as I was leaving the event around 9 o'clock, I saw Jake and Rachel at a restaurant across the street, having what appeared to be an intimate dinner for two. They were sitting close together, sharing a bottle of wine, and nothing about the scene suggested any kind of business emergency. I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, debating whether to approach them or simply go home. Something about the situation felt wrong, but I couldn't articulate exactly what bothered me beyond the fact that Rachel had lied about her reason for canceling our plans. Eventually, I decided to leave without confronting them, but the incident left me with a nagging sense of unease that I couldn't shake. When I saw Rachel a few days later for our usual coffee date, I mentioned seeing them at the restaurant, trying to keep my tone casual and non-accusatory. Rachel's face flushed immediately, and she began stammering an explanation about how Jake's business emergency had been resolved quickly, so they decided to grab a late dinner to celebrate. Her explanation was plausible enough, but something about her delivery felt rehearsed, as if she'd been prepared for this conversation. More concerning was the way she immediately changed the subject and seemed anxious for the remainder of our time together, checking her phone constantly and leaving earlier than usual. That night, I found myself lying awake thinking about all the small changes I'd observed in Rachel over the past several months. Individually, none of them seemed particularly alarming. Engaged couples naturally adjust their social lives and priorities. Wedding planning is stressful. People sometimes have legitimate reasons for changing plans or being distracted during conversations. But taken together, the pattern painted a picture that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Rachel seemed to be losing herself, becoming smaller and more uncertain with each passing week. The confident, independent woman I'd known and admired was gradually being replaced by someone who seemed afraid of making decisions or disappointing others. I began paying closer attention to Rachel's interactions with Jake during the few occasions when the three of us spent time together. What I observed was subtle but troubling. Jake had a way of making comments that seemed supportive but carried undertones of control or criticism. He'd suggest that Rachel looked tired and should stay home instead of meeting friends for dinner. He'd make jokes about her work schedule or her spending habits that weren't quite mean but left Rachel looking embarrassed or defensive. Most concerning was the way Jake would sometimes answer questions directed at Rachel or make decisions on her behalf without consulting her. When servers at restaurants asked for Rachel's order, Jake would occasionally interject with suggestions about what she should choose. When friends invited Rachel to events, Jake would sometimes respond before she had a chance to answer, explaining why she couldn't attend or what their alternative plans were. These behaviors were never overtly controlling or abusive, which made them difficult to address directly. Jake maintained his charming, supportive facade, and anyone observing their interactions might see a devoted fiancé who was simply very involved in his partner's life. But having known Rachel for 15 years, I could see how these subtle pressures were affecting her confidence and independence. The last conversation I had with Rachel took place on a Thursday evening, exactly 1 week before the accident that would take her life. We'd met for dinner at a small Vietnamese restaurant in her neighborhood, one of our favorite spots for catching up when we wanted to avoid the crowds and noise of more popular establishments. Rachel seemed more like her old self that evening than she had in months. She was animated and engaged, telling me stories about challenging projects at Morrison Associates and asking detailed questions about my latest design work. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that whatever had been troubling her was resolving itself, that perhaps the wedding stress was finally easing as their December date approached. Near the end of our meal, Rachel grew quieter and more thoughtful. She stirred her soup absently, her expression distant in a way that suggested she was wrestling with something important. Finally, she looked up at me with an intensity one hadn't seen from her in months. "Emma," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if I told you something that might sound crazy, would you believe me?" The question sent a chill through me, not because of what she was asking but because of the fear I heard in her voice. Rachel had never needed my permission to share difficult truths with me. Throughout our friendship, we discussed everything from family problems to career challenges to relationship troubles with complete openness and trust. "Of course I believe you," I replied, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "You can tell me anything, Rach. You know that." She nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking her head with frustration. "I don't know how to explain it," she said finally. "I don't even know if I understand it myself. It's just that everything feels different now, and I can't figure out if it's me or if something else is happening." Before I could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. Rachel glanced at the screen, and her face immediately changed, the openness and vulnerability of moments before replaced by familiar anxiety. "I have to go," she said, gathering her purse and jacket quickly. "Jake needs me to help him with something." I watched her leave, knowing instinctively that whatever she'd been about to tell me was important, possibly crucial. I should have followed her. I should have insisted we finish the conversation. I should have trusted my instincts that something was seriously wrong in Rachel's life and demanded answers instead of accepting her reassurances that everything was fine. Instead, I paid the check and went home, planning to call Rachel the next day to continue our conversation. I never got the chance. The call came at 6:23 on a Friday morning, jolting me awake from deep sleep. Jake's voice on the other end of the line was raw with emotion, barely recognizable through his sobbing. "Emma," he said, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. "There's been an accident. Rachel's car went off the road last night on her way home from work. She didn't make it. She's gone." The world stopped making sense after that phone call. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in my pajamas, staring at the rain streaking down my bedroom window, trying to process Jake's words. Rachel was gone. My best friend of 15 years, the person who knew me better than anyone else in the world, had died alone in her car on a dark stretch of Highway 26. The next few days passed in a blur of arrangements, phone calls, and the surreal experience of planning a funeral for someone who had been so vibrantly alive just days before. Jake took charge of most of the arrangements, which seemed natural given that he was Rachel's fiancé. He coordinated with the funeral home, selected flowers, and handled the logistics with an efficiency that I initially attributed to his business background and his way of coping with grief. Rachel's parents, who lived in a small coastal town 3 hours away, were devastated but seemed grateful that Jake was managing the details. They were simple people who had never dealt with anything like this before, and Jake's take-charge attitude provided them with a sense of stability during an impossible time. Her mother, Patricia, kept repeating how thankful she was that Rachel had found someone so devoted and capable. I threw myself into helping however I could, desperate for something productive to do with the crushing weight of my grief. I created a memory board with photos spanning our entire friendship, wrote Rachel's obituary based on notes Jake had started, and coordinated with her coworkers at Morrison Associates to ensure they could attend the service. During this time, I noticed something that struck me as odd, though I was too consumed with my own grief to examine it closely. None of Rachel's other college friends seemed to know about the funeral arrangements. When I called Lisa Park to let her know about the service, she was shocked to learn that Rachel had died and confused about why she hadn't been contacted directly. Lisa had been part of our tight-knit group during college and had remained close with Rachel over the years, though not as close as Rachel and I were. She'd been at Rachel's engagement party and had always been included in major events and celebrations. It seemed strange that Jake wouldn't have thought to call her, but grief makes people forget important details, and I assumed it was simply an oversight. When I mentioned this to Jake, he looked genuinely apologetic and explained that he'd been so overwhelmed with arrangements that he'd only called the people whose numbers he had readily available in Rachel's phone. He asked me to reach out to anyone I thought should know, which I did, spending hours making difficult phone calls to people who deserved to hear about Rachel's death from someone who cared about her. The funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Riverside Memorial Chapel, a modest but elegant funeral home in the suburbs about 40 minutes from downtown Portland. Jake had chosen the location because it was near the cemetery where Rachel would be buried, in a peaceful setting, surrounded by old oak trees that Rachel would have appreciated. On the morning of the funeral, I woke up feeling hollow and disconnected from reality. I'd barely slept for days, and the enormity of saying goodbye to Rachel felt overwhelming. I put on the black dress I'd worn to my grandmother's funeral 2 years earlier, the only appropriate outfit I owned for such an occasion, and tried to apply makeup that would hide the evidence of constant crying. Jake had offered to pick me up on his way to the funeral, which I'd gratefully accepted. I didn't trust myself to drive in my emotional state, and the thought of arriving at Rachel's funeral alone felt unbearable. When he arrived at my apartment building at 9:30, he looked exhausted but composed, wearing a dark suit that made him appear older and more serious than usual. The drive to the funeral home was mostly silent. Jake focused intently on navigating the morning traffic, while I stared out the passenger window at the gray November sky that seemed to mirror my mood. Occasionally, Jake would make quiet comments about the arrangements or mention people who had sent flowers, but neither of us seemed capable of meaningful conversation. When we arrived at Riverside Memorial Chapel, I was surprised by how many people were already there. The parking lot was nearly full, and a steady stream of mourners was making their way into the building. Rachel had touched many lives through her work, her friendships, and her genuine kindness, and seeing the turnout was both comforting and heartbreaking. Inside the chapel, I was struck by how beautiful Jake had made everything look. The flower arrangements were tasteful and elegant, featuring the white lilies and purple iris that had been Rachel's favorites. Photos of Rachel throughout her life were displayed on easels around the room, showing her evolution from a bright-eyed college student to a confident professional woman. I found myself studying these photos with new eyes, looking for signs of the changes I'd observed in recent months. The most recent pictures, taken during her engagement period, showed Rachel smiling and happy, but there was something different about her expression that I couldn't quite identify. The confidence and spontaneous joy that had characterized earlier photos seemed more measured, more careful. Jake had asked me to speak during the service, along with Rachel's boss from Morrison Associates and her college roommate who had flown in from Seattle. I'd spent hours writing and rewriting my eulogy, trying to capture the essence of who Rachel had been and what our friendship had meant to me. Standing at the podium, looking out at the crowd of people who had loved her, I felt the full weight of her absence. I spoke about Rachel's loyalty, her infectious laugh, and her ability to make anyone feel heard and valued. I shared stories about our college adventures, our career struggles, and the way she could turn ordinary moments into cherished memories. I talked about her dreams for the future, her excitement about her upcoming wedding, and her profound capacity for love and friendship. As I delivered my eulogy, I noticed Jake sitting in the front row, tears streaming down his face. His grief appeared genuine and devastating, and I felt a wave of sympathy for him. He'd lost the woman he loved just months before their wedding, and I couldn't imagine how he was coping with such a profound loss. After the service, we moved to the cemetery for the burial. The November air was cold and damp, and a light drizzle had begun to fall as we gathered around Rachel's grave. The cemetery was older and more established than I'd expected, with mature trees and well-maintained grounds that provided a sense of peace and permanence. As the pastor spoke final words over Rachel's casket, I found myself thinking about all the conversations we'd never have, all the experiences we'd never share. I thought about the wedding she'd never have, the children she'd never raise, the decades of friendship that had been cut short by a moment of tragedy on a dark road. After the burial, people began returning to their cars to head to the reception Jake had organized at a nearby restaurant. I lingered by Rachel's grave, reluctant to leave her alone in this unfamiliar place. The reality of her death felt most concrete here, standing beside the fresh earth that covered her casket. Jake approached me as I stood there, his expression gentle and understanding. "I know this is hard, Emma," he said quietly. "She would have been grateful that you were here, that you spoke so beautifully about your friendship." I nodded, tears making it difficult to speak. Jake put his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of comfort, and we stood together in silence for several minutes. When I finally felt ready to leave, we walked back toward the parking lot together, both lost in our own thoughts. That's when everything changed. As we reached Jake's car, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted immediately, becoming tense and focused in a way that seemed jarring given the circumstances. He answered the call with a sharp, professional tone that was completely different from the gentle voice he'd been using with me moments before. "Yes, this is Jake Martinez," he said, turning slightly away from me. "I've been expecting your call." I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Jake's responses made it clear that this was some kind of business call. He spoke in clipped, efficient sentences about deadlines, contracts, and meetings, his grief apparently set aside for more pressing concerns. I stood beside his car in the drizzling rain, watching other funeral attendees load into their vehicles and drive away. The contrast between Jake's emotional devastation during the service and his sudden return to business mode felt disorienting, though I tried to rationalize it as his way of coping with loss. The call lasted nearly 10 minutes, during which time the cemetery had largely emptied of other mourners. I was getting cold and wet, but I didn't want to interrupt what seemed to be an important conversation. When Jake finally ended the call, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Emma," he said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from him before, "I'm really sorry about this, but something urgent has come up with my business. I need to handle it immediately." I stared at him, confused about what he was suggesting. The reception at the restaurant was supposed to start in 30 minutes, and people would be expecting both of us to be there. More importantly, I was depending on him for transportation back to the city. "What about the reception?" I asked, rain beginning to soak through my dress. "People are expecting us to be there." Jake looked genuinely conflicted for a moment, but then his expression hardened with resolve. "You'll be fine," he said, already moving toward the driver's side of his car. "You can catch a ride with someone else or call an Uber. This business situation can't wait." Before I could fully process what was happening, Jake was in his car and driving away, leaving me standing alone in the cemetery parking lot in my funeral dress, 3 hours from home, with no transportation and no way to get to the reception. I watched his taillights disappear down the winding cemetery road, feeling a mixture of shock, hurt, and growing anger. This was Rachel's funeral. These were Rachel's friends and family members who had come to honor her memory and support each other in grief. Jake's abandonment felt not just personally cruel but deeply disrespectful to Rachel's memory. The parking lot was now completely empty except for my own shadow stretching across the wet pavement. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of rain on leaves and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. I felt more alone than I had since receiving the news of Rachel's death. I pulled out my phone to call an Uber, but discovered that the cemetery was too remote to get reliable cell service. The few bars I could manage to connect to showed that ride-sharing services weren't operating in this area, and the estimated wait time for a taxi was over 2 hours. My first instinct was to call Lisa Park, who I knew had attended the funeral. But when I tried her number, it went straight to voicemail. I tried several other friends who had been at the service, but either couldn't reach them or learned they had already left for the reception and were too far away to return for me. As I stood there in the increasingly heavy rain, trying to figure out how to get home, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and shock of Jake's abandonment was transforming into something harder and more focused. This wasn't just about leaving me stranded, though that was cruel enough. This was about his complete disregard for Rachel's memory and the people who had loved her. I began walking toward the cemetery's main building, hoping to find someone who could help me contact a taxi or provide information about public transportation. The building appeared to be closed for the day, but I noticed a maintenance worker near the equipment shed who directed me to a small office where the cemetery manager was still working. The manager, an older woman named Helen, was sympathetic to my situation and allowed me to use the office phone to call for a taxi. While we waited for the cab to arrive, she offered me coffee and a chance to sit in the warm, dry office. Her kindness was a stark contrast to Jake's callous abandonment, and I found myself explaining the situation to her. Helen listened with the patient attention of someone who had undoubtedly heard many stories of grief and family dysfunction over the years. When I finished describing what had happened, she shook her head with obvious disapproval. In 30 years of working here, she said, I've never seen anyone leave a family member stranded like that. Especially not on the day of a funeral. That young man has some serious priority problems. Her words validated my growing sense that Jake's behavior was not just inconsiderate but fundamentally wrong. As I sat in that warm office, waiting for my taxi and processing the events of the day, I began to think more critically about Jake's actions and attitudes over the past several months. The business call that had been so urgent it couldn't wait until after Rachel's reception seemed suspicious in retrospect. Who conducts business on the day of their fiancé's funeral? What kind of emergency could be so pressing that it justified abandoning grieving friends and family members? I began to remember other instances where Jake's priorities had seemed questionable. The night Rachel had cancelled our gallery plans because of his supposed business emergency, only for me to see them having a romantic dinner. The way he would interrupt our conversations with calls that required Rachel's immediate attention. His tendency to make decisions for Rachel without consulting her. The taxi ride back to Portland gave me nearly 3 hours to think, and the more I reflected on Jake's behavior patterns, the more uncomfortable I became. I'd attributed many of his controlling tendencies to normal relationship dynamics or personality quirks, but viewed through the lens of his cruel abandonment, they took on a more sinister cast. By the time the taxi dropped me off at my apartment building, I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and deeply angry. The day that should have been about honoring Rachel's memory and supporting each other through grief had instead revealed something troubling about the man Rachel had been planning to marry. I changed out of my wet funeral clothes and made myself a cup of tea, sitting in my living room and trying to process everything that had happened. The rain continued to fall outside my windows, matching the gray mood that had settled over me. That's when I decided to call David Chen. David was Rachel's younger brother by 3 years, and someone I'd known peripherally through family gatherings and holiday celebrations over the years. He worked in cybersecurity for a tech company in Seattle and had always struck me as thoughtful and analytical. More importantly, he had loved Rachel deeply and shared my confusion about some of the changes in her behavior during her engagement. David had attended the funeral but had left early to catch a flight back to Seattle for work obligations. I wasn't sure if he'd heard about Jake's abandonment, but I felt like he deserved to know what had happened. When David answered his phone, I could hear airport announcements in the background. He was clearly between flights, but when I explained what had happened at the cemetery, his response was immediate and intense. He left you where? David's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and fury. At the cemetery? After Rachel's funeral? I recounted the entire incident, from Jake's business call to his casual dismissal of my transportation needs to his departure from the reception. David listened in silence, and I could sense his anger building with each detail. Emma, David said when I finished, there's something I need to tell you. I've been worried about Rachel for months, but I didn't know how to bring it up because it seemed like such a vague concern. His words sent a chill through me. David continued, his voice lower and more serious than I'd ever heard it. Rachel used to call me every week, just to check in and talk about whatever was going on in her life. We weren't super close day to day, but we had this regular connection that we'd maintained since college. About 6 months ago, those calls stopped happening. I felt my breath catch. David was describing the same pattern I'd noticed in my own relationship with Rachel, the gradual withdrawal and cancellation of long-standing traditions. When I would call her, David continued, she'd always seem rushed. Or distracted. She'd say she was busy with wedding planning or work, but something about her voice was different. She sounded anxious in a way that wasn't like her. David paused, and I could hear the background noise of the airport around him. Finally, he spoke again, his voice heavy with regret. The last time I talked to her, about 2 weeks before the accident, she started to tell me something about Jake. She said she'd discovered something that was bothering her, but before she could explain what it was, the call got interrupted. She said she'd call me back to finish the conversation, but she never did. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Rachel had been trying to tell both of us something important about Jake in the weeks before her death. She'd attempted to confide in me at the Vietnamese restaurant, and she'd tried to share concerns with David during their phone call. In both cases, she'd been interrupted before she could reveal whatever was troubling her. David's flight was boarding, but before he hung up, he made me promise to stay in touch about anything else I discovered about Jake's behavior. He also mentioned that he'd been thinking about going through Rachel's personal belongings to help her parents sort through everything, and he suggested that we coordinate our efforts. After ending the call with David, I sat in my apartment feeling a mixture of validation and growing dread. My instincts about Jake's controlling behavior hadn't been paranoid overreaction. Rachel's own brother had noticed similar concerning patterns, and Rachel herself had apparently discovered something about Jake that had worried her enough to reach out to both of us. The question that tormented me as I tried to fall asleep that night was what Rachel had discovered about Jake, and whether that knowledge had somehow contributed to her death. The official report indicated that her car had skidded off the road during a rainstorm, but I found myself wondering about the circumstances that had led to her being on that particular stretch of highway at that particular time. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I owed it to Rachel to understand what had been happening in her life during those final months. Jake's behavior at the funeral had revealed a callousness that seemed incompatible with the grief-stricken fiancé he'd appeared to be, and I was beginning to suspect that there was much more to discover about his true character. I began to pay attention to details I'd previously overlooked, thinking back through conversations and interactions with new eyes. I started making notes about timeline discrepancies, behavioral changes in Rachel, and Jake's patterns of control and manipulation. What emerged was a picture of a man who had systematically isolated Rachel from her support systems while maintaining a facade of being the perfect, devoted partner. The question was whether I could prove it, and more importantly, whether understanding the truth about Jake could somehow honor Rachel's memory and protect other potential victims from his manipulation. The investigation that would consume the next several months of my life began that night, born from grief, anger, and the growing certainty that Rachel's death had robbed her of the chance to expose whatever she'd discovered about the man she'd been planning to marry. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the funeral, when David Chin called me from Seattle with news that would change everything I thought I knew about Rachel's final months. He'd been going through Rachel's belongings at her parents' request, helping them decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to pack away for safekeeping. What he discovered in Rachel's home office would unravel the carefully constructed facade Jake had maintained for over 2 years. I was at my desk, working on a logo design for a new restaurant client, when my phone rang that Tuesday afternoon. David's voice was tight with controlled anger, and I could hear papers rustling in the background as he spoke. "Emma," he said without preamble, "I'm at Rachel's house going through her things, and I found something you need to see. Can you come over right now?" The urgency in his voice made my stomach clench with anxiety. David had driven down from Seattle that morning to spend the day sorting through Rachel's personal papers and belongings, a task that Jake had said he was too emotionally devastated to handle himself. At the time, Jake's reluctance had seemed understandable, even touching evidence of how deeply Rachel's death had affected him. "I'm on my way," I told David, already saving my work and reaching for my car keys. "What did you find?" "I'd rather show you in person," David replied. "But Emma, I think Rachel was trying to build a case against Jake. There are documents here, printed emails, even what looks like a timeline of incidents. I think she knew something was seriously wrong." The drive to Rachel's house in the Hawthorne neighborhood took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to imagine what kind of evidence Rachel might have been collecting and why she felt the need to document Jake's behavior. The fact that she'd been building some kind of case suggested that whatever she'd discovered went far beyond the controlling tendencies I'd observed. Rachel's house looked exactly the same from the outside, with the cheerful yellow paint she'd chosen and the small garden she'd lovingly maintained. But walking up to the front door felt surreal, knowing that Rachel would never again greet me with her infectious smile and offer to make coffee while we caught up on each other's lives. David answered the door looking haggard and deeply shaken. His normally neat appearance was disheveled, his hair uncombed and his shirt wrinkled as if he'd been running his hands through it in frustration. He led me directly to Rachel's home office, a small room off the main hallway that she'd used for handling personal business and occasionally working from home. The office was in disarray, with papers spread across every available surface and several boxes of documents stacked on the floor. David had clearly been working methodically through Rachel's filing system, but what he'd discovered had apparently disrupted his organized approach. "Look at this," David said, pointing to Rachel's desk where he'd arranged several documents in careful rows. "I found these hidden in a folder labeled Wedding Planning, but they have nothing to do with the wedding." The first document was a printout of Jake's business registration with the state of Oregon. Rachel had highlighted several discrepancies in the filing, including the fact that Jake's business address was listed as a mail forwarding service rather than an actual office location. In the margins, she'd written notes questioning why Jake would need to hide his real business address and wondering if his consulting firm was legitimate. The second document was even more damning. Rachel had printed out several pages from a business networking website that showed Jake's professional profile. But this wasn't the Jake Martinez who owned a successful consulting firm helping struggling restaurants and retail shops. According to these documents, Jake Martinez was listed as a former employee of 3 different companies, all of which had ended his employment within 6 months for reasons that were diplomatically described as performance issues and incompatibility with company culture. "Emma," David said, handing me a third document, "look at this one. It's a credit report that Rachel somehow obtained on Jake." She'd highlighted several concerning items, including multiple unpaid debts, a bankruptcy filing from 2 years earlier, and a pattern of credit accounts that had been closed due to non-payment. I studied the credit report with growing horror. Jake had presented himself to Rachel as a successful businessman with multiple clients and a thriving consulting practice. The reality appeared to be that he was deeply in debt, had a history of financial irresponsibility, and had been essentially unemployed for most of the time he'd been dating Rachel. But these weren't just random documents that Rachel had stumbled across. David showed me a notebook where she'd been systematically documenting her discoveries, complete with dates, sources, and follow-up questions she'd written to herself. The notebook revealed a methodical investigation that had been going on for at least 3 months before her death. According to Rachel's notes, her suspicions about Jake had begun when she'd offered to help him with his business taxes and he'd become evasive about sharing his financial records. She'd initially attributed his reluctance to privacy concerns or masculine pride about accepting help, but when he continued to deflect her offers of assistance, she'd begun to wonder if there was something he was trying to hide. Rachel's investigation had started small. She'd looked up Jake's business registration online, simply out of curiosity about the official name and structure of his consulting firm. When she discovered the mail forwarding address instead of a real office location, she'd begun asking more pointed questions about his work. Jake's explanations for these discrepancies, according to Rachel's notes, had been plausible but inconsistent. He told her that he worked primarily from home and used the mail service for privacy reasons. When she'd asked about meeting his clients or visiting his office, he'd explained that his business model was entirely remote and that client meetings typically took place at restaurants or coffee shops. But Rachel's suspicious nature, the same quality that had made her an excellent marketing professional, had driven her to dig deeper. She'd started paying attention to Jake's daily schedule and realized that he rarely seemed to have actual client meetings or work commitments. His phone calls, which he'd claimed were business-related, often happened at odd hours and seemed to involve personal conversations rather than professional consultations. The most disturbing discovery in Rachel's notebook was a section titled Financial Concerns, where she documented her growing realization that Jake appeared to be living beyond his means. Despite claiming to have a struggling but viable consulting business, Jake consistently had money for expensive dinners, new clothes, and entertainment expenses that seemed inconsistent with his alleged income level. Rachel had begun to suspect that Jake was supplementing his income through means he wasn't sharing with her, and she'd started paying attention to his spending patterns and financial behavior. What she'd discovered was a man who seemed to have access to funds that couldn't be explained by his supposed business activities. David handed me another document, this one a printout of banking records that Rachel had somehow obtained. "I don't know how she got access to this information," David said, "but it shows deposits into Jake's account that don't match up with any business income he should have been receiving." The banking records showed a pattern of irregular deposits, some in amounts that suggested possible loan shark activity or other unsavory financial arrangements. There were also several large withdrawals that coincided with periods when Jake had taken Rachel on expensive trips or made significant purchases. But the most chilling discovery was Rachel's timeline of what she called isolation incidents. She'd documented dozens of occasions when Jake had subtly undermined her relationships with friends and family members, often in ways that seemed supportive on the surface but had the effect of reducing her social connections. According to Rachel's notes, Jake had a pattern of creating conflicts or emergencies that would force her to cancel plans with friends. He would schedule surprise romantic gestures that coincided with events she'd been looking forward to attending. He would make comments about her friends that were subtly critical, planting seeds of doubt about their motivations or loyalty. Most disturbing was Rachel's documentation of how Jake had gradually taken control of her social calendar and decision-making processes. She'd noted how he would volunteer to handle communications with her friends, often conveying messages that were slightly different from what Rachel had intended. He would make commitments on her behalf without consulting her, then frame her objections as being unreasonable or ungrateful. Rachel had also documented Jake's increasing influence over her financial decisions. He'd convinced her to move her banking to a different institution where he claimed to have connections that could get her better rates. He'd suggested investment strategies that required her to liquidate stable savings accounts in favor of riskier options that he claimed to understand better than she did. The picture that emerged from Rachel's investigation was of a man who had systematically targeted her for financial and emotional exploitation. Jake wasn't just a controlling boyfriend who had become possessive after their engagement. He was a sophisticated con artist who had identified Rachel as a mark and had been methodically isolating her from her support systems while gaining access to her resources. David showed me the final entry in Rachel's notebook, dated just 4 days before her death. In this entry, Rachel had written about her plan to confront Jake with what she'd discovered. She decided to give him one opportunity to explain the discrepancies in his background and business claims, and if his explanations weren't satisfactory, she was planning to end their engagement and relationship. The entry also mentioned that Rachel had been in contact with someone she described as Jay's previous victim, though she didn't provide any details about how she'd located this person or what information they had shared with her. The notation suggested that Jake's pattern of targeting vulnerable women wasn't limited to Rachel, and that she'd somehow connected with another person who had experienced similar manipulation. Emma, David said, his voice shaking with emotion. I think Rachel was planning to expose Jake publicly. Look at this. He handed me a draft email that Rachel had been composing, apparently intended for her friends and family members. The email outlined her discoveries about Jake's deceptive background and warned others to be cautious about trusting him. She'd written about feeling embarrassed and manipulated, but she'd emphasized that her primary concern was preventing Jake from targeting other vulnerable women. The email was unfinished and had never been sent, but its existence showed that Rachel had been planning to take action against Jake despite the personal cost to her reputation and emotional well-being. She'd been prepared to admit publicly that she'd been deceived and manipulated, if doing so could protect others from experiencing the same betrayal. As I read through Rachel's documentation, I felt a mixture of pride in her courage and devastating sadness that she'd been dealing with this discovery alone. Rachel had been building a case against Jake with the same methodical thoroughness she'd applied to her marketing campaigns, gathering evidence and planning her strategy for maximum impact. But something had prevented her from following through with her plan. The timeline suggested that Rachel had been planning to confront Jake during the week that she died, which raised troubling questions about whether her death had been the tragic accident it appeared to be. David voiced the concern that was growing in both our minds. Emma, he said quietly, what if Rachel's death wasn't an accident? What if Jake somehow found out about her investigation and took action to stop her from exposing him? The possibility was too horrible to contemplate, but it couldn't be ignored given what we'd discovered about Jake's character and the timing of Rachel's death. I thought about the conversation Rachel had tried to have with me at the Vietnamese restaurant, her fear and uncertainty as she'd struggled to find words for whatever she'd been discovering about Jake. We need to take this to the police, I said. But David shook his head with frustration. I already called them, he replied. I spoke with Detective Maria Santos, who handled the accident investigation. She said that without evidence of foul play, Rachel's death remains classified as an accident caused by poor weather conditions. These documents prove that Jake was lying about his background, but they don't prove that he had anything to do with Rachel's death. Detective Santos had apparently been polite but clear that the evidence we'd discovered, while concerning from a personal relationship standpoint, didn't meet the threshold for reopening Rachel's case. The accident investigation had found no signs of mechanical tampering with Rachel's car, no evidence that she'd been forced off the road by another vehicle, and no indication that her death had been anything other than a tragic loss of control during hazardous driving conditions. But David had made a suggestion that would ultimately lead to our most significant breakthrough. He'd asked Detective Santos about the procedure for investigating possible fraud or identity theft charges against Jake, based on the financial deceptions Rachel had uncovered. While the police couldn't reopen Rachel's death investigation based on the evidence we'd found, they could potentially pursue charges related to Jake's misrepresentation of his background and financial status. Detective Santos had provided David with contact information for the Oregon Department of Justice's Consumer Protection Division, which handled cases involving financial fraud and deceptive business practices. She'd also suggested that we might want to contact other potential victims of Jake's deception, if we could locate them. That suggestion sparked an idea that would consume the next several weeks of my life. If Rachel had somehow located one of Jake's previous victims, then there might be others who had experienced similar manipulation. Jake's pattern of behavior seemed too sophisticated and systematic to have developed with Rachel as his first target. I decided to start my investigation with Jake's previous location in San Diego, where he claimed to have lived before moving to Portland. If Jake had been targeting vulnerable women there as well, there might be police reports, civil court records, or other documentation that could help establish a pattern of deceptive behavior. David agreed to coordinate the legal aspects of our investigation while I focused on tracking down Jake's history and potential previous victims. We both understood that we were essentially conducting a private investigation into a man who had clearly demonstrated a willingness to lie and manipulate for personal gain, which meant we needed to be careful about our safety and legal exposure. That evening, I began my research into Jake Martinez's background in San Diego. Using the business networking profiles Rachel had discovered, I was able to piece together a timeline of Jake's employment history and previous addresses. What I found was a pattern of short-term jobs, frequent relocations, and what appeared to be a systematic effort to reinvent himself every 18 to 24 months. The most promising lead came from a business registration I found for a consulting firm Jake had apparently operated in San Diego under a slightly different name. The business had been dissolved after only 8 months, with filings that indicated inability to meet financial obligations as the reason for closure. More interesting was a small news article I found in the San Diego Tribune's business section, reporting on a lawsuit filed against Jake's consulting firm by a local restaurant owner who claimed that Jake had misrepresented his credentials and had provided advice that had nearly resulted in the restaurant's bankruptcy. The lawsuit had apparently been settled out of court, but the article mentioned that the restaurant owner, Maria Gonzalez, had accused Jake of targeting her business during a vulnerable period following her husband's death. The detail about targeting a business owner during a period of grief following spousal loss felt sickeningly familiar. It suggested that Jake had a specific preference for victims who were dealing with major life transitions or losses, circumstances that would make them more susceptible to manipulation and less likely to carefully scrutinize his background claims. I spent hours that night searching for more information about Maria Gonzalez and her restaurant, eventually finding contact information for the business through online directories. I debated whether to reach out to her directly, knowing that reopening painful memories about Jake's deception might be traumatic for someone who had already been victimized. But the urgency of preventing Jake from targeting other vulnerable women ultimately outweighed my concerns about causing distress to his previous victims. If Maria Gonzalez had experienced manipulation similar to what Rachel had endured, she deserved to know that Jake was continuing his pattern of deception with new victims. The next morning, I gathered my courage and called Maria Gonzalez's restaurant in San Diego. When I explained that I was investigating Jake Martinez in connection with my best friend's death, Maria's response was immediate and intense. "That man destroyed my business and nearly destroyed my life," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of anger and pain even 2 years after her experience with Jake. "I tried to warn people about him, but he was too smart about covering his tracks." Maria's story was heartbreakingly similar to what Rachel had experienced. Jake had approached her restaurant during a period when she was struggling to keep the business afloat following her husband's death. He presented himself as a successful consultant with expertise in restaurant turnaround strategies, offering to help her save the business her late husband had built. Over the course of several months, Jake had convinced Maria to implement costly changes to her restaurant's operations, all while charging substantial consulting fees that had drained her remaining cash reserves. When the strategies failed and Maria realized that Jake's credentials were largely fabricated, she'd tried to sue him for fraud and misrepresentation. The lawsuit had been settled when Jake agreed to leave San Diego and cease operating his consulting business, but Maria had never recovered the money she'd lost or been able to rebuild her restaurant to its previous success level. More devastating had been the emotional manipulation Jake had employed, convincing Maria that her business failures were due to her own poor judgment rather than his incompetent advice. "Emma," Maria told me, "that man is dangerous in ways that go beyond money. He knows how to identify women who are grieving or vulnerable, and he knows exactly how to make them doubt their own instincts." By the time I realized what he was doing, I'd lost not just my business but my confidence in my ability to make good decisions. Maria's description of Jake's manipulation tactics was so similar to what I'd observed happening to Rachel that it felt like listening to a preview of what Rachel's life would have become if she'd lived to see Jake's true nature fully revealed. The systematic erosion of confidence, the isolation from friends and family, the financial exploitation disguised as helpful guidance. Most chilling was Maria's revelation that Jake had apparently researched her background extensively before approaching her, knowing details about her husband's death, her financial situation, and her emotional vulnerabilities that he couldn't have learned through casual conversation. His targeting of her hadn't been opportunistic but deliberately calculated. Maria also confirmed my suspicion that Jake had been operating under multiple identities. In San Diego, he'd used the name Jake Martinez Rodriguez and had claimed to be a certified business consultant with a master's degree in business administration. When Maria had tried to verify his credentials after their business relationship soured, she discovered that both the university degree and the professional certification were fabricated. The conversation with Maria convinced me that Jake represented a genuine threat to other potential victims and that Rachel's investigation into his background had been both necessary and dangerous. If Jake had been willing to relocate from San Diego to Portland to escape the consequences of his actions there, he would likely be willing to take even more drastic steps to protect himself from exposure in Portland. That realization made me acutely aware of my own safety as I continued investigating Jake's background. If he had somehow discovered Rachel's investigation and had taken action to silence her, then my own research into his activities could potentially put me at risk as well. But the alternative of allowing Jake to continue targeting vulnerable women was unacceptable. Rachel had died before she could complete her mission of exposing Jake's true nature, and I felt a responsibility to honor her memory by finishing what she'd started. Over the next several days, I worked with David to compile all of Rachel's documentation along with the additional information I'd gathered about Jake's activities in San Diego. We prepared a comprehensive package of evidence that we planned to present to both law enforcement and consumer protection agencies, hoping that the pattern of deception across multiple states would be sufficient to trigger a formal investigation. But as we prepared to take legal action against Jake, I realized that we needed to be prepared for the possibility that he would retaliate against our efforts to expose him. Jake had already demonstrated a willingness to abandon me at Rachel's funeral when his interests conflicted with basic human decency. If he felt threatened by our investigation, there was no telling how far he might be willing to go to protect himself. The question that kept me awake at night was whether Jake had somehow discovered Rachel's investigation before her death, and whether her accident had been as random as it appeared. The timing of her death, just days before she'd planned to confront him with her evidence, seemed too convenient to be entirely coincidental. As I prepared for the confrontation that I knew was inevitable, I found myself thinking about Rachel's courage in investigating Jake despite the personal cost to her emotional well-being. She'd been willing to admit publicly that she'd been deceived and manipulated if doing so could protect others from experiencing the same betrayal. I was determined to honor that courage by ensuring that Jake's pattern of exploitation was finally exposed, regardless of the personal risks involved in pursuing the truth. The confrontation I'd been preparing for came sooner than expected, and in a way that caught me completely off guard. I was at Brew and Bean Cafe on a rainy Thursday morning, meeting with Tom Wilson from Rachel's office at Morrison Associates, when Jake walked through the door like he owned the place. Tom had been Rachel's closest colleague and had agreed to meet with me after David reached out to him about our investigation. As the senior marketing director, Tom had worked closely with Rachel on several major campaigns and had noticed the same behavioral changes in her during the months before her death that David and I had observed. Tom was in his mid-40s, a soft-spoken man with graying temples who had genuinely cared about Rachel as both a colleague and a friend. He'd been devastated by her death and was eager to help us understand what had been happening in her life during those final months. We'd been talking for about 20 minutes when Tom suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his face draining of color as he stared over my shoulder toward the cafe entrance. I turned to see Jake Martinez standing just inside the doorway, scanning the room with the predatory intensity of someone hunting for specific prey. Our eyes met across the crowded cafe, and Jake's expression shifted from casual scanning to focused recognition. He smiled, but it wasn't the warm, charming smile I remembered from our early interactions. This smile was cold and calculating, the expression of someone who had been caught but wasn't particularly concerned about the consequences. Jake approached our table with confident strides, ignoring the obvious discomfort on Tom's face and the tension that had immediately filled the air around us. He pulled out an empty chair and sat down without invitation, his movements deliberate and territorial. Emma, he said, his voice carrying a false warmth that made my skin crawl. What a pleasant surprise running into you here. And Tom, good to see you again. Tom mumbled an uncomfortable greeting, clearly recognizing that something significant was happening but uncertain about the dynamics at play. I realized that Jake's appearance at this specific cafe at this exact moment couldn't be coincidental. He'd either been following me or had somehow learned about my meeting with Tom. I hope you don't mind me joining you, Jake continued, settling back in his chair as if he belonged there. I was just thinking about Rachel, wondering how her friends are coping with everything. Grief can make people do strange things sometimes, can't it, Emma? The implied threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Jake was letting me know that he was aware of my investigation and that he considered my actions to be the behavior of someone not thinking clearly due to grief. It was a masterful manipulation, designed to make me question my own judgment while positioning himself as the reasonable, concerned party. Tom looked between Jake and me, clearly sensing the undercurrents of hostility but not understanding their source. He made polite conversation for a few minutes before excusing himself, claiming he had a client meeting to attend. I could see the relief on his face as he gathered his things and left the cafe, escaping a situation that had become inexplicably tense. Once Tom was gone, Jake's facade dropped completely. The charming smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of cold calculation that I'd never seen from him before. This was the real Jake Martinez, stripped of the persona he'd crafted to manipulate Rachel and everyone else who had known him. So, Jake said, leaning forward slightly, I hear you've been asking a lot of questions about me lately. Questions about my business, my background, my relationship with Rachel. I'm curious about what's driving this sudden interest in my personal affairs. I met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by his aggressive posture or threatening tone. People care about Rachel, I replied evenly. They want to understand what was happening in her life before she died. Jake's laugh was harsh and humorless. People care about Rachel, he repeated mockingly. Is that what you call spreading rumors and making accusations based on half-understood information? Because that's what I'm hearing you've been doing. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be effective. I had been making inquiries about Jake's background, and some of those inquiries had involved sharing my concerns about his behavior with Rachel's friends and family members. But I wasn't spreading rumors, I was uncovering truth that Jake had worked hard to conceal. I'm not spreading rumors, I said firmly. I'm trying to understand why Rachel was so unhappy during the months before her death, and why she was building a case against you. Jake's eyes narrowed at the mention of Rachel's investigation. For the first time since he'd sat down, he looked genuinely surprised and concerned. The revelation that I knew about Rachel's documentation had clearly caught him off guard. Rachel wasn't building a case against me, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. Rachel was planning our wedding. She was excited about our future together. I pulled out my phone and showed Jake a photo I'd taken of one of Rachel's notebook entries, the one where she'd documented his pattern of isolation tactics and financial deceptions. Jake stared at the image for a long moment, his face cycling through a range of emotions from shock to anger to what looked like grudging respect. You went through her things, he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. You violated her privacy. And went through her personal belongings looking for something to use against me. The accusation was designed to make me feel guilty and defensive, but I refused to take the bait. David went through Rachel's things with her parents' permission, I replied. Rachel wanted people to know the truth about you. She was planning to expose your lies before she died. Jake leaned back in his chair, studying me with the calculating expression of someone reassessing a threat level. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice taking on a different quality, more personal and intimate. Emma, he said, I think you're misunderstanding what you found in Rachel's notes. Rachel was going through a difficult period before her death. She was stressed about the wedding, anxious about combining our finances, worried about all the normal things that couples deal with when they're planning a future together. His tone was gentle and reasonable, the voice of someone trying to help a confused friend understand a complex situation. It was the same voice he'd used to manipulate Rachel, and I could see how effective it would be on someone who wasn't prepared for his tactics. Those notes you found, Jake continued, they represent Rachel's anxiety and uncertainty, not some kind of investigation into wrongdoing. Rachel loved me, Emma. We were planning a life together. Whatever you think you've discovered about my background, it doesn't change the fact that Rachel and I were happy. The gaslighting was sophisticated and skillful, designed to make me question not just my interpretation of Rachel's evidence but my understanding of her emotional state during her final months. Jake was rewriting history in real time, turning Rachel's courageous investigation into evidence of mental instability. But I'd seen too much evidence of Jake's deception to be swayed by his manipulation. Rachel's documentation was too detailed and systematic to be dismissed as anxiety-driven. Paranoia. Her discovery of his false credentials, his hidden debts, and his pattern of targeting vulnerable women represented a deliberate investigation, not confused worry about wedding planning. Rachel discovered that you've been lying about everything, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Your business, your education, your financial situation, all of it was fabricated. She found out about Maria Gonzalez in San Diego and what you did to her restaurant. The mention of Maria's name hit Jake like a physical blow. His carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing a flash of panic before he managed to regain his composure. But that momentary lapse told me everything I needed to know about the accuracy of my accusations. You don't know what you're talking about, Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maria Gonzalez was a failed business owner who blamed her problems on everyone except herself. The fact that Rachel somehow contacted her doesn't mean anything. Except that Rachel was looking for reasons to doubt our relationship. The deflection was weak and defensive, a stark contrast to Jake's earlier confident aggression. I could see that the revelation of how much I knew about his background had fundamentally shifted the dynamic of our confrontation. Jake was no longer in control of the narrative. I pressed my advantage, pulling out additional documentation that David and I had compiled. We know about the bankruptcy, the fake degrees, the pattern of targeting grieving women. We know that. You've been running the same con for years, moving from city to city whenever someone gets too close to exposing you. Jake stared at the papers I'd spread on the table between us, his face cycling through emotions as he recognized various documents from his past. Some were items that Rachel had uncovered during her investigation, but others were records that David and I had obtained through our own research into his background. The most damaging document was a copy of the settlement agreement from Maria Gonzalez's lawsuit, which included specific language about Jake ceasing his business operations in San Diego and making no further contact with Maria or her associates. The document proved that Jake's version of events in San Diego was completely fabricated. You think you're very clever, Jake said finally, his voice taking on a new edge of menace. But you have no idea what you're dealing with here. Rachel's death was a tragedy, but it was an accident. Nothing you found changes that fact. The implicit threat in his words was unmistakable, but it was his casual reference to Rachel's death that sent chills through me. There was something in his tone, a lack of genuine grief or sorrow, that suggested Rachel's death was more convenient than tragic. From his perspective, Rachel was going to expose you, I said, watching Jake's face carefully for his reaction. She was planning to tell everyone the truth about who you really are. Her death was very convenient timing for you. Jake's response was swift and vicious. Are you suggesting that I had something to do with Rachel's accident? He hissed, leaning forward aggressively. Because that's a very serious accusation, Emma. The kind of accusation that could have legal consequences for someone who can't prove what they're saying. The threat was clear, but it also revealed Jake's desperation. He was no longer trying to charm or manipulate me into backing down from my investigation. Instead, he was resorting to intimidation and legal threats, tactics that suggested he was running out of options for controlling the situation. I'm not making accusations, I replied carefully. I'm simply noting that the timing of Rachel's death was very convenient for someone who was about to be exposed as a fraud. Jake gathered the documents I'd shown him and slid them back across the table toward me, his movements sharp with controlled anger. You need to be very careful about the path you're choosing, Emma, he said, his voice low and threatening. Grief can lead people to make poor decisions they might regret later. He stood up from the table, towering over me in a way that was clearly intended to be intimidating. But instead of feeling afraid, I felt a surge of anger at his attempts to threaten me into silence. This was the same man who had systematically isolated Rachel from her friends and family, who had lied to her about every aspect of his background, who had left me stranded at her funeral. You can threaten me all you want, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. But the truth about what you did to Rachel is going to come out. Too many people know now for you to cover it up. Jake's smile returned, but it was cold and predatory. We'll see about that, he said. Portland is a small city, Emma. People talk. Reputations can be damaged very easily when the wrong information starts circulating. With that parting threat, Jake walked out of the cafe, leaving me alone at the table with my heart pounding and my hands shaking from the adrenaline of our confrontation. But despite his attempts to intimidate me, I felt a sense of triumph. Jake's aggressive reaction to my investigation proved that I was on the right track. His threats and deflections confirmed that he had something significant to hide. More importantly, his response to the mention of Maria Gonzalez and the timing of Rachel's death had revealed cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Jake was no longer the charming, grieving fiancé who had fooled everyone into believing. He was devastated by Rachel's loss. He was a cornered predator who was running out of options for protecting himself. That evening, I called David to report on my confrontation with Jake. David listened intently as I described Jake's threats and his reaction to learning about the extent of our investigation. When I finished, David was quiet for a long moment. Before speaking, "Emma," he said, "I think we need to move faster than we originally planned. If Jake is threatening you directly, then he's feeling cornered, and cornered people can be dangerous." David had been working with Detective Santos and the Consumer Protection Division to build a formal case against Jake based on the evidence we'd compiled. But bureaucratic processes moved slowly, and Jake's escalating aggression suggested that we might not have the luxury of waiting for official investigations to reach conclusions. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the timing of Rachel's death," David continued. "I know the police ruled it an accident, but what if we approached this from a different angle? What if we could prove that Jake had motive to silence Rachel?" The suggestion was both exciting and terrifying. If we could establish that Jake had known about Rachel's investigation and had felt threatened by her plan to expose him, we might be able to convince authorities to take a closer look at the circumstances surrounding her death. But pursuing that line of investigation would also mean accepting the possibility that Rachel had been murdered, a reality that was almost too painful to contemplate. The thought that someone had deliberately taken Rachel's life was devastating. But it was also a possibility that we couldn't ignore given what we'd learned about Jake's character and methods. David had already been in contact with Tom Wilson about Rachel's behavior during her final weeks at Morrison Associates. Tom had confirmed that Rachel had seemed distracted and anxious, but he'd also mentioned something that we hadn't known before. Rachel had asked Tom about the company's employee assistance program, specifically about resources for people dealing with personal safety concerns. The revelation that Rachel had been worried about her personal safety added a new dimension to our understanding of her final weeks. If Rachel had felt threatened by Jake's behavior, it suggested that her investigation into his background had progressed further than her written notes indicated. Tom had also mentioned that Rachel had been staying late at the office more frequently in the weeks before her death, claiming that she needed quiet time to work on projects without distractions at home. But given what we now knew about Jake's controlling behavior, it seemed more likely that Rachel had been using her office as a safe space to conduct her investigation away from his oversight. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had discovered dangerous truths about the man she was supposed to marry and who had been trying to protect herself while building a case against him. Rachel's caution and secrecy about her investigation suddenly made sense in the context of someone who was dealing with a potentially dangerous individual. Over the next few days, I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly, hyper-aware of my surroundings and suspicious of anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to me. Jake's threats had been subtle but clear, and I knew that he was capable of escalating his tactics if he felt sufficiently threatened by my investigation. But I also felt more determined than ever to see the investigation through to its conclusion. Rachel had died before she could expose Jake's true nature, but her documentation and courage had provided the foundation for continuing her mission. I owed it to her memory to ensure that Jake faced consequences for his actions and that other potential victims were protected from his manipulation. The breakthrough that would ultimately lead to Jake's downfall came from an unexpected source. Lisa Park, who had been following our investigation with growing concern for my safety, had been conducting her own research into Jake's background using resources available through her work at the hospital. As a nurse, Lisa had access to certain databases and professional networks that weren't available to the general public. She'd been using these resources to verify Jake's claims about his educational background and professional credentials, building on the foundation that Rachel had established with her initial discoveries. What Lisa found was even more damaging than what Rachel had uncovered. Jake hadn't just fabricated his business credentials and financial status. He'd also been operating under multiple identities, using variations of his name and completely different background stories depending on his target audience and objectives. Lisa had discovered records showing that Jake had been investigated by authorities in 3 different states for various forms of fraud and identity theft. While he'd never been formally charged due to lack of evidence and the reluctance of victims to testify, the pattern of accusations was clear and consistent. More importantly, Lisa had found evidence that Jake was currently under investigation by federal authorities for possible involvement in a larger identity theft ring. The investigation was ongoing and confidential, but the mere existence of federal interest in Jake's activities suggested that our local concerns about his behavior were part of a much larger pattern of criminal activity. Armed with this new information, David and I were finally able to convince Detective Santos to take our concerns seriously. The revelation that Jake was already on law enforcement radar for federal crimes gave credibility to our claims about his manipulation of Rachel and provided a foundation for reopening questions about the circumstances of her death. But even as we prepared to present our evidence to authorities, I knew that Jake would not go quietly. His threats during our confrontation at the cafe had made it clear that he was prepared to fight back against anyone who tried to expose him. The question was how far he would be willing to go to protect himself, and whether we were prepared for whatever tactics he might employ in his defense. The final confrontation was approaching, and I knew that everything we'd worked to uncover about Jake's true nature would soon be put to the ultimate test. The final confrontation took place in the most unexpected setting imaginable, the community center where Rachel had volunteered for 3 years, helping organize events for local charities and fundraising drives. It was a place filled with memories of Rachel's generosity and community spirit, which made it the perfect location for exposing the man who had tried to destroy everything she represented. The event was supposed to be a memorial celebration of Rachel's life, organized by her colleagues at Morrison Associates and the various charitable organizations she had supported. Jake had somehow inserted himself into the planning process, positioning himself as the grieving fiancé who wanted to honor Rachel's legacy. What he didn't know was that David, Lisa, and I had been working with Detective Santos and federal investigators to turn the memorial into a carefully orchestrated trap. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would allow Jake to deliver his prepared eulogy about Rachel, giving him enough rope to hang himself with his lies and manipulations. Meanwhile, federal agents would be positioned throughout the audience, ready to arrest him when he finished speaking. The memorial would serve its intended purpose of honoring Rachel's memory, while also ensuring that justice was finally served for the woman who had died trying to expose the truth. The community center was packed with nearly 200 people who had known and loved Rachel throughout her life. Her parents sat in the front row, still devastated by their daughter's death but grateful for the outpouring of support from her friends and colleagues. Behind them sat representatives from every aspect of Rachel's life: college friends, work colleagues, neighbors, and volunteers from the various organizations she had supported. I had been asked to speak early in the program, sharing memories of our 15-year friendship and the impact Rachel had made on everyone who knew her. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces that represented Rachel's extended community, I felt the weight of everything we had discovered about Jake's deception and manipulation. My speech focused on Rachel's courage and integrity, her willingness to stand up for what was right even when it came at personal cost. I talked about her investigative instincts, her refusal to accept easy answers when something felt wrong, and her commitment to protecting others from harm. Every word was carefully chosen to honor Rachel's memory while also preparing the audience for what they were about to learn about the man she had been engaged to marry. When I finished speaking, there was enthusiastic applause that seemed to fill the entire room with warmth and love for Rachel's memory. But I could see Jake sitting in the front row, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. He understood the subtext of my speech, the way I had highlighted Rachel's investigative nature and her commitment to truth. He knew that something was coming, but he couldn't leave without raising suspicions about his own guilt. Several other speakers followed, each sharing different aspects of Rachel's life and personality. Tom Wilson spoke about her professional excellence and her mentorship of younger colleagues. A representative from the animal shelter where Rachel volunteered talked about her compassion for vulnerable creatures and her dedication to improving their lives. Lisa Park shared memories of college adventures and the way Rachel had maintained friendships across decades and distances. Each speech built a picture of a woman who was beloved, respected, and deeply missed by everyone who had known her. The contrast between the Rachel being celebrated and the isolated, anxious woman Jake had been turning her into during her final months became increasingly stark as the program continued. Finally, it was Jake's turn to speak. He approached the podium with the confident stride of someone who believed he was in complete control of the situation. His prepared remarks were polished and emotional, painting a picture of devoted love and shared dreams that had been tragically cut short by Rachel's unexpected death. Jake spoke about meeting Rachel and being immediately captivated by her intelligence and kindness. He described their courtship in romantic terms, emphasizing his deep appreciation for her professional success and his support for her career ambitions. He talked about their engagement and the excitement they had shared while planning their future together. Everything Jake said was technically true but fundamentally dishonest in its omission of the manipulation and control he had exercised over Rachel's life. He presented himself as the perfect supportive partner, someone who had encouraged Rachel's independence and celebrated her achievements. The audience listened with sympathy, moved by what appeared to be genuine grief and love. But I could see through Jake's performance to the calculation beneath. He was using Rachel's memorial as an opportunity to cement his image as the devoted fiancé, making it harder for anyone to believe accusations about his true character. Every tear, every pause for emotion, every tremor in his voice was carefully calibrated for maximum impact. As Jake reached the climax of his speech, talking about the future he and Rachel would never have together, I noticed federal agents beginning to position themselves near the exits. Detective Santos was standing at the back of the room, speaking quietly into a radio. The trap was about to be sprung. Jake concluded his speech with a promise to honor Rachel's memory by continuing the charitable work she had been passionate about. He pledged to establish a foundation in her name and to dedicate his life to the causes she had cared about. The audience responded with moved applause, completely unaware of the irony of a con artist promising to manage charitable funds in honor of the woman he had been systematically defrauding. As Jake stepped back from the podium, the program moderator announced that there would be a brief intermission before the final portion of the memorial service. But instead of people filing out for refreshments, Detective Santos approached the front of the room with 2 federal agents flanking her. "Jake Martinez," Detective Santos said in a clear voice that carried throughout the silent room, "you're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." The shock that rippled through the audience was palpable. People turned to each other in confusion, unable to process what they were witnessing. Jake's carefully maintained composure cracked completely, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and desperate calculation as he realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "You can't do this here," Jake protested, his voice rising with panic. "This is Rachel's memorial. These people are grieving." The irony of Jake claiming concern for the grieving attendees was lost on no one who understood the situation. This was the same man who had abandoned me at Rachel's funeral, who had systematically isolated her from her support systems, who had been preparing to steal her financial security under the guise of love and partnership. As the federal agents moved to handcuff Jake, he made one final desperate attempt to maintain his victim narrative. "This is all a misunderstanding," he called out to the stunned audience. "I loved Rachel. I would never have hurt her. These people are making false accusations because they can't accept that she's gone." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence against Jake was overwhelming, and his dramatic arrest at Rachel's memorial only served to highlight the calculated cruelty of his character. Anyone who still harbored doubts about his true nature was forced to confront the reality of who he really was. Detective Santos addressed the audience briefly, explaining that Jake had been under federal investigation for multiple identity theft and fraud schemes spanning several states. She assured everyone that Rachel's death remained classified as an accident, but acknowledged that Jake's arrest meant that Rachel's family and friends could find some measure of justice for the deception and manipulation she had endured during her final months. As Jake was led away in handcuffs, shouting protests and accusations that no one believed, I felt a complex mixture of relief, satisfaction, and profound sadness. Justice was finally being served for the man who had targeted Rachel during her vulnerable period of adjustment to their relationship. But no amount of legal consequences could bring Rachel back or give her the chance to see Jake face accountability for his actions. The memorial service continued after Jake's arrest, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a celebration of Rachel's life had transformed into a moment of collective realization about how completely they had all been deceived by Jake's carefully constructed persona. People who had liked and trusted Jake were forced to confront their own vulnerability to manipulation and deception. In the weeks that followed Jake's arrest, the full scope of his criminal activities began to emerge through court filings and media reports. The federal investigation revealed that Jake had been operating identity theft schemes in multiple states, targeting vulnerable individuals who were dealing with major life transitions like death of a spouse, divorce, job loss, or serious illness. Rachel had been just one victim in a larger pattern of exploitation that had affected dozens of people across the country. Jake's method was always the same: research potential targets through social media and public records, identify their vulnerabilities and sources of financial assets, then approach them with fabricated credentials and a story designed to appeal to their specific needs and circumstances. The investigation also revealed that Jake had been working with a network of accomplices who helped him create false identities, forge documents, and launder money obtained through his various schemes. Rachel's death had actually been inconvenient for Jake's broader criminal operation because it had attracted attention to his activities in Portland just as federal investigators were closing in on his network. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Jake had been systematically documenting his manipulation tactics and keeping detailed records of his victims' psychological profiles. Federal agents found notebooks filled with observations about how to exploit grief, loneliness, and financial anxiety for maximum criminal advantage. Rachel had been reduced to a case study in Jake's twisted research into human vulnerability. The revelation that Jake had been treating Rachel's emotions and trust as experimental data rather than genuine human connection added another layer of violation to his already extensive list of crimes. It explained his calculated approach to isolating her from friends and family, his systematic undermining of her confidence and decision-making abilities, and his precise timing of financial manipulation. During the trial preparation process, Maria Gonzalez from San Diego agreed to testify about her experiences with Jake, providing crucial evidence about his pattern of targeting grieving business owners. Her testimony helped establish that Jake's relationship with Rachel was part of a deliberate criminal strategy rather than a romance that had gone wrong. Other victims came forward as well, including a widow in Phoenix who had lost her entire retirement savings to one of Jake's investment schemes, and a divorced man in Denver who had been convinced to sign over his house deed as collateral for a business loan that never materialized. Each victim's story followed the same basic pattern: Jake identifying vulnerability, building trust through false credentials and emotional manipulation, then systematically extracting financial assets, while isolating victims from potential sources of help. The federal prosecutor handling Jake's case described it as one of the most sophisticated and cruel fraud schemes she had encountered in her career. Jake's willingness to exploit grief and emotional trauma for financial gain demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that went beyond typical white-collar crime. Jake ultimately pled guilty to multiple federal charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, but he was still facing 25 years in federal prison. More importantly for Rachel's family and friends, his conviction meant that his pattern of victimizing vulnerable people had finally been stopped. The foundation that Jake had promised to establish in Rachel's name was actually created by her family and friends, but with proper oversight and genuine commitment to the causes Rachel had cared about. The foundation focused on financial literacy education for people dealing with major life transitions, helping potential victims recognize and avoid the kind of manipulation tactics that Jake had employed. David took a leadership role in the foundation, using his technology background to develop resources and educational materials that could help people protect themselves from financial predators. Lisa contributed her healthcare expertise to create programs specifically designed for people dealing with grief and loss, the population most vulnerable to the kind of exploitation Rachel had experienced. I found my own purpose in sharing Rachel's story and the warning signs of financial manipulation through speaking engagements and educational workshops. The courage Rachel had shown in investigating Jake's deception, even when it meant admitting her own vulnerability to manipulation, became a powerful example for others facing similar situations. The memorial service that had ended with Jake's arrest became a turning point for everyone who had known Rachel. Instead of being remembered as the woman who had been deceived by a charming con artist, Rachel was celebrated as the investigator who had uncovered a dangerous criminal network, and whose documentation had been crucial in bringing Jake to justice. Her parents found comfort in knowing that their daughter's final months had been spent protecting others rather than simply being victimized. Her colleagues at Morrison Associates established a scholarship in her name for students studying investigative journalism and consumer protection. Her friends carried forward her legacy by staying vigilant about the warning signs of manipulation and by supporting others who found themselves in vulnerable situations. The relationship between David and me evolved into a genuine friendship based on our shared commitment to honoring Rachel's memory and protecting others from similar exploitation. We discovered that grief shared with someone who truly understood the loss could be transformative rather than just devastating. Lisa eventually met someone through her volunteer work with the foundation, a fellow healthcare worker who appreciated her strength and independence rather than trying to control or manipulate her. Watching Lisa build a healthy relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection helped heal some of the wounds left by witnessing what Jake had done to Rachel. The house in Hawthorne that Rachel had shared with Jake was sold, with the proceeds going to the foundation established in her memory. But before the sale was finalized, David and I spent a day there gathering the last of Rachel's personal belongings and ensuring that nothing of value was left behind. In the back of Rachel's bedroom closet, hidden behind winter coats she rarely wore in Portland's mild climate, we found one final piece of evidence that completed our understanding of her investigation into Jake's background. It was a safety deposit box key and a note in Rachel's handwriting with the box number and location. The safety deposit box contained copies of all the evidence Rachel had gathered about Jake's deception, along with additional documentation we hadn't found in her home office. But more importantly, it contained a letter addressed to me, written in Rachel's careful script and dated just 3 days before her death. In the letter, Rachel explained that she had suspected Jake might be monitoring her communications and had therefore been unable to share her discoveries with me directly. She wrote about her fear that confronting Jake might be dangerous, but her determination to expose his true nature regardless of the personal cost. The letter ended with an instruction that broke my heart and filled me with pride simultaneously. "If something happens to me before I can finish this," Rachel had written, "please don't let Jake get away with what he's done. Use this evidence to protect other women from going through what I've experienced. Don't let my death be meaningless." Rachel's final request became the guiding principle for everything that followed. Her death had not been meaningless because her courage and investigation had provided the foundation for stopping a dangerous criminal and protecting countless potential victims from similar exploitation. The letter also contained Rachel's forgiveness for any mistakes I might have made in failing to recognize the signs of Jake's manipulation earlier. She acknowledged that sophisticated predators like Jake were skilled at hiding their true nature and that even people who loved her couldn't have been expected to see through his carefully constructed deception. Reading Rachel's final words to me, written when she knew she was in danger but was determined to see her mission through to completion, reinforced my commitment to honoring her memory through continued vigilance and education about financial predators. Jake's conviction and imprisonment marked the end of his ability to harm others, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of everyone who had been affected by his crimes. Rachel's death had been a tragedy, but her legacy became a force for protection and justice that extended far beyond what she could have imagined. The foundation established in Rachel's memory continued to grow and expand its reach, helping hundreds of people recognize and avoid financial manipulation. The educational materials developed through the foundation were used by law enforcement agencies, consumer protection organizations, and victim advocacy groups across the country. Most importantly, Rachel's story became a powerful example of how individual courage and investigation could expose dangerous criminals and protect vulnerable communities. Her willingness to document Jake's deception, even when she was isolated and afraid, provided the evidence that ultimately brought him to justice. Standing in the cemetery where Jake had abandoned me on the day of Rachel's funeral, I reflected on the journey that had brought us from that moment of cruel abandonment to Jake's arrest and conviction. The man who had thought he could manipulate and control everyone around him had ultimately been defeated by the courage and determination of the woman he had tried to destroy. Rachel's grave was covered with flowers from friends, family, and people who had never met her but had been protected by her investigation into Jake's criminal activities. Her headstone bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of who she had been: she sought truth and protected others. The fight against financial predators who target vulnerable people continues, but Rachel's legacy ensures that her voice remains part of that ongoing battle. Every potential victim who recognizes warning signs because of educational materials developed through her foundation, every law enforcement officer who uses her case as an example of investigative courage, every friend who pays attention when someone they care about seems to be changing in concerning ways carries forward the protection that Rachel's life and death made possible. Jake Martinez was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, where he would spend the rest of his productive adult life paying for the cruelty and manipulation he had inflicted on so many innocent people. But more importantly, Rachel Thompson's memory became a shield protecting others from experiencing the isolation, deception, and betrayal that had marked her final months. The woman who had died trying to expose a dangerous predator had ultimately succeeded in her mission, even though she didn't live to see justice served. Her courage, determination, and refusal to accept deception became the foundation for protecting countless others from similar exploitation. In the end, love and truth had triumphed over manipulation and lies, just as Rachel had always believed they would. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.